Hello everybody. We're still talking about the Middle Ages, and today we're going to talk about Crusades, something that happened during the Middle Ages. And so the Crusades were the series of wars that occurred between the Christians and the Muslims. So there are probably a lot of reasons that people have had wars in history. So talk to the people around you about why. What are some reasons that you think that people have wars, fight each other? What would be some reasons why they would have wars? So talk to people around you, write some things down in your notebook, and then we'll come back. Okay, so one date here that you might want to write down: in 1081, the Seljuk Turks, which were a group of Islamic people that lived in the country of Turkey, what's now Turkey, but they were called the Turks. They took over a lot of the old Byzantine Empire, and they had come from Central Asia, and they'd converted to Islam, so they were Muslims, and they took over a lot of the territory that used to be controlled by the Byzantine Empire, which was Christian. And one of the things that they took over was what's called, known to Christians as the Holy Land. So that's Palestine. And if you're familiar at all with Bible stories, Jerusalem, and all those areas that are considered holy to the Christians were in this territory that the Turks had taken over. So in 1095, Pope Urban II, remember what a pope is, that's the head of the Catholic Church, he urged all the Western European kingdoms to attack the Muslims who had taken over the Holy Land so they could get the Holy Land back. And if you do a little bit of research into the Islamic religion, this area is also holy to them. So you have two different groups, both wanting the same territory. So let's think about that for a minute and think about, does that make you think of anything that might be going on today, or anything that you've read about in history or in literature in the past? So take a few minutes and talk about this conflict between the Christians on one hand, the Muslims on the other hand. They want the same territory. So talk about if that reminds you of any other conflicts that you've heard about. So by 1096, a big army from a lot of the European countries was sent down to the Holy Land, and they fought against the Muslims, and the Western European nations, the Christian forces, were successful in taking Jerusalem, and they divided the city into four parts, and they were in some ways very, very brutal to the Muslims that lived there. They were not nice at all. They had won the battle for the time being, but they were four different groups, so they divided the city up into four parts. How do you think that this would make the Muslims that lived in that area, that had captured that area, what would they think about this? What would be their feelings, and what do you think they would be motivated to do? So talk about that for a minute. Okay, reasons for fighting in the Crusades. A lot of people did have religious reasons, so religion was a reason. They believed that God wanted them to go and take the Holy Land back from the Muslims. Another reason that some of the fighters might have gone was to gain more territory for themselves, and also power. And power means you have control over people and areas and business and trade and all those kinds of things. So there's some reasons. There might be some other reasons that people would go and fight in the Crusades. So think about that for a minute. Maybe write something down if you think of some other reasons. But ultimately, in 1187, the Muslims had, there was another crusade. The Muslims were fighting better. The Christians were not agreeing with each other. They were kind of fighting themselves a little bit, arguing, and it ends up with the Muslims winning. And at that time, the the Christian forces, the European forces were defeated and they never did retake the Holy Land. And this conflict has lasted up till today between some of the Western nations, some Christians, and some Muslims. So think again, if you can draw any comparisons or you see anything about this era that might actually be even influencing our era today, our time today, how would that be influenced by this fighting in the Crusades back in the Middle Ages? So talk about that. Okay, so the Crusades, again, a series of wars fought between the Western Christian nations and the Muslims, mostly the Turks. And so what were some of the effects of the Crusades? One effect was increased trade, because when the Crusaders from Europe went down there to fight, they found out about all these neat things that the Muslims had, some spices, fabrics, different things that they could bring back then to their countries and sell, trade. Increased use of money happened during this time. Also, lots of new learning happened because the Muslims had made some really kind of cool advances in science and technology. They knew things that the Europeans didn't know, and just by coming in contact with each other, the Europeans learned some things that they didn't know. So things about navigation, using a compass, using what's called an astrolabe, which is a device that you can look at the stars and kind of determine where you are, which is handy when you're out in the middle of the ocean. You can't really see any land forms, so you've got to look at the stars to determine where you're located. They also preserved the ancient knowledge of the Greeks and Romans, and because in a lot of cases, when the barbarians took over the western part of the empire, the Roman Empire, they destroyed a lot of that learning, but a lot of it was preserved in the Byzantine Empire and by the Muslims. Also, like I said, advances in math and science. The Europeans learned about gunpowder and paper from the Muslims, the Turks, come via the Chinese. So you see China's way over in the east, and then these people had come from the east, and they came to the area of Turkey and Palestine and all those places, and they brought knowledge about gunpowder and paper with them, so the Europeans were able to learn about that. So what would you think would happen? What might change in Europe as a result of all these effects, the increased trade and the new learning and other things? So you can do in your research, you can look into some other effects of the Crusades. So what do you think that would do to European society? Remember, we talked about the feudalism, how it was organized. Would that make any change? Would that cause any changes to come about? So think about that. We're going to be talking about that more about that later. So talk to the people around you about the effects of the Crusades, and be sure to write some things down in your notebook. See you next time.